JavaScript arrays come with dozens of built-in methods, but you do not need to memorize all of them. In this video, I'll show you 10 or 11 array methods that you will use constantly when building JavaScript, React, Angular, or Node.js applications. So for every method, we'll look at what the method does, what it returns, whether it changes the original array, and a practical code example. The first method we are going to take a look at is the JavaScript map method. This is a popular method in JavaScript that is used to iterate through arrays. So the map method is an iterative method. What it does basically is it transforms every item in an array and returns a brand new array. So think of it as one input that results in one output. So whatever you have in the array, you transform it and then it will return a new transformed array. So let's use a very simple example. So the example right here, const numbers, I'll call this, I will use this right here. And what I want to do is to double the values inside this array. So each value inside this array will be doubled and then we return a new array. So here I'll say const doubled equal to numbers.map. Right here you can see I have this code completion, but I don't want to use it, and num multiplied by 2. Okay, and right here I will just do a console log. So what we have done here with this map, we are multiplying each value inside the array by 2 to double the value, and once it iterates to the end, it will return a new array. Now let's try this out. So I'll say node 1 dash, and you can see the value right here. So 1 times 2, 2, 4, 2 times 2, 4, and it increased or doubled the values with a new array returned. We can also use it to probably return an array with a specific object. So let's say we have an object, I'll say users right here. Okay, so ID and name, and now I want to return just the names from this array. And here I'll say const usernames, user.map, and then we pass in the callback, we return user.name. If you want to return only the IDs, you can say user.id. It will return just the ID. And then we do a console log, usernames right here. Okay, so if I run this, you can see we have the names. If I change this to ID, you can transform it. We can do something like this, backticks user ID with user.id and name. So you can see it right here. Okay, so just note that you use the map method to transform an array and then return a new array. The next method we want to look at is the filter method. This is also a very popular method. The filter method is an iterative method just like the map method. What it does is it creates a new array with all elements that pass the test implemented by the provided function. So in the filter method, we pass a callback function and the array will return a new array with values or elements that pass the tests implemented in that callback function. So in other words, it returns only the elements that satisfy a condition. That is what the filter method does. So this is very simple. An example, numbers. Okay, so what I want to do is to return only the even numbers. Okay, so I want to use the filter method to return only the even numbers in this array. So this will be const, I'll say even numbers equal to numbers.filter, and we use num, pass the callback, and we return num modulo 2 equal to 0. So basically in JavaScript, this is how you check if a number is even or odd. Okay, so if the number modulo 2, that is what this means. If the remainder, if you divide the number by 2, if its remainder is 0, that means it's an even number. But if its remainder is not 0, it's an odd number. So 1 divided by 2, we usually have a remainder. 2 divided by 2, 1 without no remainder. 3 divided by 2, it has a remainder. So this is how we check, and I can do console.log even numbers. Okay, and let me run this. So node to filter, and you can see it returns 2, 4, because they are the only numbers in this array that when you divide by 2, the remainder is 0. And we can do the same thing here to filter out active values from an object array. So const, I can say users, and I have an array, yes, and we have ID, name is active. So what I want to do is I want to return only the object where is active is true. Okay, so I want to return the object where is active is true. I'll just say const. Maybe I can use this my autocomplete code completion right here. I can remove this. So the idea here is users.filter. Remember that filter returns an array, but it will return only the elements that satisfy the condition. And this is the condition. This is the same as saying user.isActive is equal to true. But in ES6, we don't need to add this part. It would, since it's a Boolean, it will check for object where is active is true, and then we return it. Now let me run this again, and you can see we have 2 values. If I set this to false, run this, you can see it returned only 1 object inside the array. So this is what the filter does. It returns only elements that satisfy a certain condition. And you can use the filter method to search for results, to filter completed tasks, to filter products, to search for active users. So you can use the filter method to do such. The flat method is another array method that we can use. So think of a situation where you have nested arrays. Okay, so for example, you have a nested array like this. So I'll say numbers. So you have an array of numbers 1 and then 2, and then inside you have another sub array 3, 4, and then you have another sub array 5, 6. Now what you want to do, you're thinking, okay, how do I return just one array instead of this nested array for right here? Now previously we could use the reduce method to do that, but now JavaScript has a method that we can use to just flatten the array, and it's called the flat method. So the flat method creates a new array with all sub arrays concatenated recursively up to a specific depth. So what it does is it does not change the original array. It just concatenates all the arrays and then returns a new array. So the idea is it flattens the array. So all the sub arrays are combined, are concatenated or flattened, and then a new array is returned. So we have this array with sub arrays, and we want to return just one array. We can do that. I can say console.log with numbers.flat. Okay, so numbers.flat, we call the flat method. But this flat method, it can also receive number property. So that number property basically is like the depth to which you want the sub-arrays to be concatenated. But in this case, since we don't have a deep level sub-arrays, we just have a one level sub-array, it's fine this way. So if I run this, it should return just one array right here. This is supposed to be numbers, okay? It's supposed to return one array, and you can see it just returned one array. But there are cases where we might have a deeply nested arrays and we want to flatten everything. So what I can do is, let me create a new array. So const, I'll call this nested. Let me create a deeply nested array. Maybe I can use this. Okay, let me move this here. And you can see 7, or I can add 7, 8. You can see that this is deeply nested, okay? And if I try to add a depth, so console.log nested.depth, let me set the depth to 1. Now you're going to see what will happen, okay? So you can see it is deeply nested. So right here, and you can see it only flattened it up to this first level. You can see 2 is in the second array, but it only flattened it. If I change this to 2, and then you can see it only flattened the first 2 arrays, okay? But there might be times whereby you don't really know the depth to which the sub array or the array goes. What you can do is simple. We can use infinity, the infinity property. So using the infinity property will flatten the array irrespective of the depth it has. Okay, so let me run this now. And you can see now it returns just one array. Okay, so if you don't really know the depth to which the nested arrays or the sub arrays run, you can just use infinity and it will flatten everything. We already saw the flat method that returns a single array with all sub arrays. So it flattens arrays that contain sub arrays and then return a single array. Now there is another method called the flatMap. The flatMap combines both the map method that we've already seen and the flat method into one operation. So it combines the map method and the flat method. The flatMap method returns a new array formed by applying a given callback function to each element inside the array. So the idea of the flatMap is it uses both the map method and the flat method to flatten an array. So let's see an example. Okay, so let's say we have this, I'll say words. This is hello world and good morning. Okay, so I have this array, and what I want to do is I want to return a new array that contains individual words inside this array like this. So I want to insert here. You can see hello world is one string, good morning is another string. But what I want to do is I want to return them inside the array as individual elements inside the array. Now we can do that using the map and the flat together, something like this. We can say const, or let me do console.log. Okay, and here I'll say words.map. And first with the map, we split based on the space right here. Okay, so this will be word.split, and then we call the flat method. Okay, remember I said the flat map combines the map and the flat. So if I run this right here, This will be 4. You can see now it returns an array that contains the individual words. But instead of doing this, we can instead use the flatMap. Okay, so const new results equal to words dot flatMap, and then I'll pass word inside the callback with word dot split. I want to split by the space. Okay, and then we pass new results. So instead of doing this right here, combining both map and flat, we just call flatMap and then pass the callback or the condition we want to use to split. Okay, and if I run this now, you can see it returns the same result. So let me comment this. You can see they both return the same result. Okay, so this is if you combine the map and the flat, but this case we just used only the flatMap method. Okay, there are other examples as well. You can do that inside an object. The JavaScript reduce method is one of the most popular JavaScript array methods, and sadly it's one of the methods that a lot of JavaScript developers don't really like using because it's kind of a bit complicated for people to understand. So the idea of the reduce method is it executes a reducer function that you provide. So the reducer function or a callback function on each element of the array, resulting in a single output value. Let's take, for example, you have an array and you need to sum the values of the inside the array, so numbers. So let's say you want to sum all these values. The reducer method, what it does is it will execute a reducer function on each element and then combines them and then returns a single output value. Okay, so we have this number array and we want to get the sum of all these values. So what we do is const, I'll say total equal to numbers dot reduce. Now for this, in the callback it takes two properties. Okay, so I'll call the first one the sum and the second one the num. Okay, and I'll return sum plus num, and then the first value that it needs to work with is, I'll pass it right here, which is 0. So you can see here in the callback it has the previous value, the current value. Okay, you can also get the current index, and then it needs a value to start with, and in this case we are starting with 0 as the value. Okay, so in the reducer function we have the previous value, the current value, and we have the function that we are executing, and also we pass in the value, the initial value that we need to start with, and then console log, and this is going to be total. So clear and node right here, and this is numbers. Okay, right here, and you can see it returns the sum. If I start this with 1, let's see what it's going to return. You can see it returns 16 because I started with 1. If I start this with 10, it returns 25. So it will start, instead of starting from 0, it will start 10 plus 1, 11, 11 plus 2, 13, 13 plus 3, up until it gets to the last value. But in our case, since we are starting with 0, so 0 plus 1 is 1, 1 plus 2, 3, 3 plus 3, 6, just like that until it gets the last value. Okay, and we can also use it to group, or if we want to count occurrences, let's say const fruits, and I want to count the occurrences of maybe a particular fruit that I have. Okay, and let me do this. Okay, and now so const fruit count equal to fruits dot reduce. Okay, so we have the count and the fruits, and we have our callback right here. Okay, so I want to return an object where we have the count as the key and then the value, whatever it counted as the value. So this will be count and then in brackets fruit equal to, now we need to set count with fruits or 0 plus 1. So what this means is it checks if this whatever fruit that we already set, if it doesn't have a value, it sets the value to 0. So for apple, when it counts apple at first, it doesn't have a value, so it sets the value to 0, and then it sets 0 plus 1. Okay, and then it goes to the next one, it checks if it already exists. If it doesn't exist, it sets the value to 0, then add 1, and it goes until it goes through everything in the array. Okay, so here I can run this and you can see we have apple 3, banana 2, orange 1. Okay, so this is what we can do with the reduce method. It's the most, or one of the most powerful array methods. The forEach method is a method that executes a provided function once for each array element. It is used to iterate over an array and perform a specific action for each element. Unlike map that returns a new array, forEach returns undefined. It's used to iterate and maybe make changes to items inside an array, but it returns undefined. The map method returns a new array, forEach method returns undefined. And let's say we have numbers, and I just want to log the numbers or do whatever I need to do with the numbers. So this will be numbers dot forEach. Remember that it returns undefined, and here I can just say console.log num, let's say multiplied by 2. Okay, so that is what the forEach method does. It returns undefined. If you try to set the return value to a variable, that variable will be set to undefined. So it's just used to iterate over an array and perform specific actions on the element while returning undefined. And here node, and you can see it iterated and then doubled the values. The JavaScript sum method tests whether at least one element in the array passes the test implemented by the provided function or by the callback function. So if you want to check if at least one element inside an array passes a certain condition, you can use the sum method. And this method returns true if at least one element satisfies the condition. Otherwise, it returns false. So for example, if you want to check if we have at least one number greater than 10, so numbers, okay, so if you want to check if there is at least one number greater than 10 inside this array, we can use sum. Okay, so I could say const is greater than 10 equal to numbers dot sum, and then I'll say num. So num greater than 10. Console log So we expect this to be false because if you check, there is no number here that is greater than 10. So this should return false. Right here, you can see it returns false. So it's used to check if at least one item, okay, if I change this to 4, this should return true. You can see it returns true because we have at least one number that is greater than 4. Okay, if I say greater than or equal to, it will still return true because we have 4 and 5. Okay, so this is the idea of the sum. We can also use it if we're inside an array object and we want to check if there's an object where the age is greater than or equal to 30. Okay, so if I run this, you can see it returns true as well. Okay, so you can use it in just a plain array or an array object. The every method is like the JavaScript sum, where the JavaScript sum just checks if at least one element. The JavaScript every method tests whether all elements in the array pass the test implemented by the provided function. It returns true if all elements satisfy the condition, otherwise false. Okay, so here as well I can use numbers, or the simplest examples, numbers, and here we want to check if every number is greater than 0. So I can do a console.log and say numbers.every right here, and we pass the provided function and we check if it's greater than 0. So as you can see, it returns true because every number inside is greater than 0. Okay, but if I have 0 here, this should return false. Okay, it should return false. You can see it returns false because 0 is not greater than 0. So every element must satisfy the condition. But for some, at least only one element is required to satisfy the condition. So that's the difference between every and some. The next JavaScript array method we want to take a look at is the find method. So the find method returns the first element in the array that satisfies the provided testing function. So if you have an array of elements and you pass in a condition, the first item that matches that condition, irrespective of the fact that there might be multiple elements that satisfies that condition, it only returns the first element that matches that condition. If the value satisfies the testing function, it returns undefined. Okay, so that is whenever you are using the find method, you always have to check for undefined from the returned value. So if no result is returned, it returns undefined. So an example right here, let's use our number array, and I want to check right here if there is we have a value equal to 3. Okay, so and right here it returns 3. But if we don't have 3 and I run it again, you can see it returns undefined. That is why you have to check, let's say const result equal to number.find, and then in a normal application you would want to do something like this: if result, and then you do whatever you want to do. so that you'll be able to handle the undefined case. Because if you need to use this result and you don't handle the undefined case, you might get an error, you will get an error in your application. So you have to find a way to manage the undefined case, or check for the undefined case. The includes method determines whether an array includes a certain value among its entries, returning true or false as appropriate. So the includes method returns a boolean, true or false. It checks if the array contains a certain value based on the condition that is passed into the includes method. Now, it is useful for checking for the presence of a specific element in an array. It does not modify the original array. Okay? And also the includes, it makes sense to use the includes if you have like a very small array. But if it's an array that contains hundreds of thousands, millions of elements, it will become very slow. So it's more appropriate for very small arrays. And we do this, so const, I'll say fruits, and we do this, and console.log, and I want to check if it has bananas, fig right here. So let's see. Okay, so this is just how we use the includes. It checks if it's whatever you pass in here, it checks if it has it. Okay, and node right here, run. This is true because it has banana, and false because it doesn't have fig. Okay, so this is just the idea of using the includes method. Like I said, it doesn't modify the original array. It just returns a boolean of true or false.